Hi everyone, welcome to the Craftcore channel. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I attach my binding to my quilts using a machine sewing method. You don't need anything fancy to do this. I'm going to be doing this on my 1930s sewing machine, but you can use it on any machine at all, anything that has a straight stitch. The reason why I use a sewing machine instead of hand sewing is that my hand sewing is absolutely terrible. I wish I was better. I am not. I really like finishing my quilts, so this is the way that I like to do it, and I think it looks pretty good in the end. So the quilt that I'm going to be working on today is this one here. It's already been sandwiched, it's already been quilted, it's ready to go. All we have to do is trim it and attach our binding. I'm going to be cutting out 2.5-inch strips from this fabric here. I think it's going to look really cute when it's coordinated together. Let's get started. So this is the quilt that we're going to be working on. I've already gone ahead and trimmed all the edges, and it's already squared up and ready to go. So the first thing that we need to do is figure out how much quilt binding we need to make. So imagine that this is our quilt. We need to know the width and the length of it. So our width is 59 inches. Our length is 87 inches. So we need to multiply this by 2 and this by 2, plus add an additional 10 inches. So we have our 2 lengths, our 2 widths, and 10 extra inches just for corners and overlapping, which brings us to a grand total of 302 inches for this quilt. So our goal is going to be creating a 2.5-inch strip that is 302 total inches long. Now that you know how many total inches of quilt binding you need, you'll need to calculate how many strips of binding fabric you'll need to be able to make that much quilt binding. Measure the width of your fabric, excluding the unusable selvage edge. Mine is 42 inches. Take the amount of binding you need and divide it by that number. So in my case, that's 302 inches divided by 42 inches for a total of 7.19 strips. I'd round up that number to the nearest whole number, so I'll need 8. However, we need to keep in mind that we need extra to join each of those strips together. We'll be doing diagonal seams to reduce the bulk, so you need to account for an extra 2.5 inches per seam. So to join 8 strips, there would be 7 joins, or an extra 7 times 2.5 inches, or 17.5 inches total lost to joining seams. If 17.5 inches fits inside the rounded up value, great. Otherwise, you need to cut 1 additional strip. And now keep in mind that you need to substitute in all your own measurements for your specific scenario. If all this math is confusing, there is a great calculator online available at cutsoquick.com. I'll put the link in the video description below for you. I'll be cutting out 8 strips at 2.5 inches wide from my binding fabric. To easily cut the fabric, fold your binding fabric in half, selvage to selvage. Use a rotary cutter to cut 2.5-inch strips from the fabric. Take a pair of your strips and with the right sides together, place them perpendicular to each other. You can either trim off all your selvages first, or you can wing it like me and simply overhang the selvages so they're not part of the overlap. You'll be sewing a diagonal line like this, from this point to this point, as shown here. When you press it open, you'll see that the strips will be joined with a lovely diagonal seam. Repeat this process until all of your strips are joined. You can cut off the excess fabric, leaving an approximate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you should have one long strip. Measure it to double check that you have the length you needed from our first calculation, in my case, the 302 inches of binding. Take the strip to the ironing board and iron it in half lengthwise. This will turn your strip into a 1.25 inch wide strip. Now the time has come to actually attach it to the quilt. We'll be sewing with the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You'll notice that I'm using a walking foot on my machine, but it's not actually necessary. I like this one because it's the only foot I have that's exactly 3/8 of an inch from needle to edge of foot. It won't actually matter where you start as long as you're not starting on a corner, because in the end, you won't be able to tell your finishing join apart from any other diagonal joins we made. So place your quilt face down on your sewing machine bed and align the binding raw edge to the raw edge, leaving approximately an 8 to 10 inch tail. Start sewing the binding in place. I don't pin or clip much for this very first step. I simply align the edges of the quilt with the edges of the binding and I sew. You just want to make sure that it doesn't come misaligned from the fabric. As you sew, you'll just want to make sure that your binding and the edge of your quilt don't shift. When you approach your first corner, sew until you reach exactly 3/8 of an inch away from the corner, then leave your needle in your work and lift the presser foot and pivot. Sew directly into the outer corner of your work at a 45-degree angle. Cut the thread, then remove your work from the machine. Using that 45-degree line as a guide, lift your work and flip the binding over and across to your right. Holding your work carefully, bring that same binding back across towards the left, making sure that the 45-degree fold is holding in place. This will help us make a lovely 45-degree mitered corner later. Pin or clip it in place and help guide your work back under the sewing machine and lower your needle 3/8 of an inch from both sides. You'll essentially be going right back into the same hole that you originally came out of before. Continue sewing along all 4 sides of the quilt, repeating the corner strategy each time you reach it. When you get back to your original side, sew until you're approximately 8 to 12 inches from where you originally left your binding tail dangling. The longer of a gap you leave, the easier it is to do the special joining technique to attach these together. Remove your work from the sewing machine and take it to a flat surface. You'll need 3 straight pins. Take 1 pin and mark approximately halfway in between your 2 tails on the quilt. It's not necessary to be super precise on this first pin. Take your left binding tail and drape it flat over towards the right. Using a second pin, mark exactly 1.25 inches past the first pin. Then cut along that line. Now with your right binding tail, drape it flat towards the left, over top of your other pin. Using a third pin, mark exactly 1.25 inches past your first pin, and then cut along that pin line. You'll see now that you have two shorter binding tails that overlap. Remove your original pin. Open up each of the bindings. You'll have to bunch up your quilt a little in order to have the ends reach each other, which feels awkward, but bring the right sides together and layer them so that your left binding is on top and your right binding is under, edges perpendicular like this. Bring your work back to your sewing machine and sew a 45-degree seam right here. Before trimming off the excess fabric, flip around the binding to make sure that the binding is not flipped or twisted. Ask me how I know. If it looks good, you're ready to trim off all the excess. Leave about approximately 1/4 inch. Now you can finish sewing the last bit of binding in place. I think that joining the binding is the hardest part of this entire process, so now it's behind you. Hooray! The next step is to bring the binding to the front of the quilt. You'll want the front and the back of the binding to be equal distance on the back and the front, so that when you sew, both sides of the binding will be caught evenly in the stitches. For this process, I'm a huge fan of these Wonder Clips. I'll put a link in the description to the clips on Amazon. The clips make it easy to line up the binding and they're sturdy enough not to shift at all. I can't live without these. If you don't have them, you can pin with straight pins. It'll be totally fine. When you reach a corner, you'll want to carefully arrange the fabric so that it forms a neat 45-degree angle. Here's how to do it. Once you have the entire binding clipped or pinned in place, it's time to sew. Every time you reach a corner, take care to leave the needle in the exact overlapping corner, pivoting the entire work by 90 degrees to start your next line of sewing. Once you've sewn all 4 sides, you're done. Trim any stray threads and you can now enjoy your fully completed quilt. I hope that this video will help you finish the binding on one of your quilts. If you like this video, I have more quilting tutorials over on my channel, Craftcore. Be sure to like this video and subscribe for more sewing and crafting videos. See you next time!